She asked to sleep in the barn. The cowboy's answer made the whole ranch go quiet. The woman came up the long dirt road on foot, carrying a canvas bag and nothing else. And when she reached the gate, she did not ask for water or a meal or a ride to the next town. She asked to sleep in the barn. Everyone who later heard the story assumed they understood what kind of arrangement that was. A stranger looking for shelter and a rancher deciding whether to grant it. But the truth of that evening was stranger and quieter than anyone imagined, because Hollis Cade did not answer her the way a cautious man should have, and what he said instead was the thing the whole ranch would still be talking about years later. If you have ever wondered what it costs a careful man to let someone in, stay with this one to the end. It was late September, the kind of evening when the light goes copper and then gray all at once, and Hollis was standing at the fence mending a broken rail when he saw her coming, small against the wide brown land, moving with the steady, unhurried walk of someone who had already walked a long way and intended to walk further if she had to. He did not go to meet her. That was not his way. He finished driving the nail he was working on, set the hammer down, and waited, because the land taught a man patience if nothing else did. And Hollis Cade had learned patience the hard way, in a house that used to hold more people than it did now. The ranch had been his father's, and his father's father's before that. 300 acres of grass and rock and hard water that had passed down through men who did not talk about their feelings so much as they built fences around them, literal and otherwise. Hollis had buried his father 2 winters back and his mother the winter before that. And somewhere in the space between those 2 funerals, he had stopped expecting anyone to come up that road who wasn't already gone. The house had 4 bedrooms and he used 1. The kitchen table sat 6 and he ate at the corner of it, standing sometimes because sitting down to a big empty table felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. He kept the ranch running because the cattle didn't care about his grief, and neither did the seasons, and there was a kind of mercy in work that did not ask a man how he was feeling. He had a hired hand, an older fellow named Amos Teague, who came by 3 days a week and said little but noticed everything, and beyond that, Hollis lived the way a lot of men in that country lived, which is to say, alone and mostly at peace with it. Though peace was maybe too strong a word. Settled might be closer. Not happy, not this, but something closer to accustomed. The way a man gets accustomed to a limp. The barn stood behind the house, old but sound, built by his grandfather out of timber that had gone silver gray with age. And it was the first thing visitors saw when they came up the road, because the house sat further back, half hidden by a stand of cottonwoods that his mother had planted before he was born. Hollis kept the barn clean and dry, because that was where the winter hay went and where 2 horses and a milk cow spent the cold months. And there was a small room off the side, once used for tack and now mostly empty, with a single window that let in the morning light. He had not thought of that room as a place anyone might want to sleep until the moment the woman stopped in front of him, canvas bag over one shoulder, dust on her boots, and asked for it plainly, without apology or explanation. Her name was Delia Foss, though he did not learn that until later, and what he noticed first was not her face, though her face was worth noticing, but her hands, which were not soft, and her eyes, which did not drop when his met them. She said she did not need a bed in the house and did not want charity. She said she would work for the room, whatever work he had, and that she only needed the barn until she could see her way to something more permanent. She said this the way a person recites something they have said before, practiced smooth by repetition, and Hollis understood 2 things in that first minute that most men might have missed. The first was that she had asked this question at other doors before his and been turned away, or worse. The second was that whatever had put her on that road, she was not going to explain it standing at his gate in the fading light, and pressing her for it now would only teach her that he was one more door not worth trusting. So he did not ask why a woman traveled alone with one bag and no destination she was willing to name. He looked at her a long moment, the way he looked at a horse before deciding whether to buy it, not unkindly, just carefully. And then he said the thing that would follow him around the county for years afterward, the thing that made old Amos Teague go quiet the next morning when he heard it, and made the women at the mercantile lean in close over their coffee. He said, "The barn's no place for a person to sleep. You'll take the room at the top of the stairs. It's got a door that locks from the inside, and I'll hear it if you use it, because these floors talk." Then he picked his hammer back up and went on mending the rail, as if he had not just overturned every expectation she or anyone else might have carried up that road, as if what he'd offered was no more remarkable than telling her which trail led to the well. She stood there a moment longer, and something in her face shifted. Not gratitude exactly, not yet, but a kind of recalibration, as though she were rewriting a sum she had already worked out and finding a different answer than the one she'd expected. "I can pay in work," she said again, quieter this time, and Hollis nodded without looking up. "Ranch always needs work done. We'll find some for you come morning." That was all. No further questions, no conditions beyond the ones already spoken, no attempt to learn her story before he'd offered her shelter from the coming cold, and it was that absence of demand, more than the offer itself, that would matter most in the seasons ahead, though neither of them understood that yet, standing there in the long light with the fence half mended between them. He showed her the house that night, walked her through it the way a man walks a stranger through rooms he has stopped truly seeing himself, pointing out the kitchen, the well pump, the room at the top of the stairs with its narrow bed and its window facing east. He did not offer supper beyond bread and cold meat, because that was what there was, and she did not ask for more, eating at the corner of the table across from him in a silence that was not uncomfortable so much as careful, two people feeling out the shape of an arrangement neither had planned. When she went up the stairs, he heard the door close, and a moment later, just as he'd told her, he heard the small metal sound of the lock turning, and something in him eased at that sound, the recognition that she trusted the offer enough to use the safety in it, and did not feel the need to leave the door open to prove she wasn't afraid. He lay awake a while that night in his own room down the hall, listening to the house settle the way it always did, the old boards ticking as the temperature dropped, and he found himself thinking not of who she was or where she'd come from, but of the barn, and how strange it was that a person would ask for that, would expect that to be granted, would have learned somewhere along the road that a barn was the best a stranger could hope for. He did not sleep easy that night, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the kind he'd grown used to, the flat gray insomnia of a man alone in a house too big for him. This was something else, a low, unfamiliar hum of attention, the sense of a house that had one more breathing person in it than it had had the night before, and whatever that feeling was, he did not have a name for it yet, only the certainty that something in the quiet architecture of his days had shifted. The way a single stone moved in a wall changes the pressure on every stone around it, even if none of them fall. Morning came the way it always came on that ranch, gray at first and then gold, the light climbing over the eastern ridge and pouring down through the cottonwoods, and Hollis was up before it, as he always was, moving through the kitchen in the dark to get the coffee going before the day's work started. He half expected to find the upstairs room empty, the woman gone before dawn, the way people sometimes went when the previous night's offer felt too good or too strange to trust in daylight. But when he came in from the barn with the milk pail, she was already at the table, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled, and she looked at him and said, "Where do you want me?" in a voice that held no question mark of uncertainty, only a statement of readiness. And that was the morning the real story began, though the town would not hear the shape of it for a long while yet. He put her to work mending fence because that was honest work that did not require trust so much as a strong back, and he watched, without seeming to watch, the way she held the hammer and the way she measured the rail before she cut it, and he saw that she was not new to this kind of labor, that her hands knew wood and wire the way his own did, and something in him filed that fact away carefully, the way a man notes the depth of a creek before deciding whether to cross it. They worked in a silence that suited them both, broken only by the practical language of the task. Pass me that, hold this steady, mind the nail, and by midday the fence line looked better than it had in a year, and Hollis found himself standing back to look at it the way he used to look at finished work before his parents died, with something like satisfaction instead of the flat completion he'd grown used to feeling. Amos Teague arrived that afternoon to find a stranger driving fence posts on the Cade land, and Hollis explaining nothing beyond, "She's staying a while, working for her keep." And Amos, who had known Hollis's father and had buried more friends than he liked to count, only raised an eyebrow and said, "Does good work," after watching her for a few minutes, which from Amos was practically a benediction. He did not ask where she'd come from either, not that day, though the question sat behind his eyes the way it sat behind everyone's, because in that country, a woman traveling alone with no family and no clear destination was either running from something or toward something, and most people, if they were honest, understood those were often the same motions seen from different angles. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them had planned, but both seemed to settle into with an ease that surprised them. Delia rose before Hollis some mornings and had the coffee going when he came down, and he found he did not mind the reversal of a routine he'd held alone for 2 years. She worked hard and asked for little, and in the evenings when the light went copper and then gray, she sat on the porch step with a mending basket, not because her own clothes needed it, but because his did. Shirts gone thin at the elbow, socks worn through at the heel, the small accumulated neglect of a man who had stopped noticing his own comfort because there had been no one to notice it for him. He watched her do this the first evening without saying anything, and on the second evening he brought out 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without being asked, and that was the whole of the conversation that passed between them, but it said more than either of them would have managed in words. She did not talk about herself, and he did not press, though he noticed things the way a careful man notices things. He noticed that she flinched, just slightly, at the sound of a wagon approaching on the road, and relaxed only once she could see who it was. He noticed that she kept the canvas bag she'd arrived with tucked beneath her bed rather than unpacked into the small dresser in the corner of the room, as though some part of her had not yet agreed to stay. He noticed that when Amos, meaning no harm, asked one afternoon where she hailed from, she answered with the name of a town 2 counties over in a voice that was too smooth, too rehearsed, the same practiced tone she'd used the first evening asking for the barn, and Hollis filed that away too without comment, the way he filed away the depth of a creek. He asked Amos once, riding the fence line together at the far edge of the property, what he made of her, and Amos took his time answering, the way he took his time with most things. "She works like someone who's had to prove herself before," he said finally, "and she watches doors. Every room she's in, she knows where the doors are." Hollis said nothing to that, but he thought about it that night, lying awake in the quiet house, listening for the small sounds of her moving in the room above his, and he understood that Amos had put words to something he himself had only felt, a kind of watchfulness in her that no amount of hard work or easy silence could fully soften. Weeks became a season. The cottonwoods went from green to gold to bare, and the first hard frost came and silvered the grass, and still she stayed, and still neither of them named what was growing between them, because naming it felt like a risk neither was ready to take. But there were signs, small and practical, the way most true things on that ranch announced themselves. She learned to read the weather the way he did, watching the western sky for the particular gray that meant snow rather than rain. She learned which of the horses needed a gentle hand and which needed a firm one. She began setting two places at the table without being told, and Hollis began, without quite deciding to, sitting down at the table instead of standing at the corner of it, because a table set for two did not feel like the same accusation as a table set for six with only one chair pulled out. One evening in early November, with the wind picking up outside and the first snow threatening in the low clouds over the ridge, she sat mending a shirt by lamplight and said, without looking up, "You never asked me why I came here." Hollis was carving a new handle for a broken hoe, and he did not stop the work because stopping would have made the question feel larger than he wanted it to feel, though it was already large enough. "Didn't figure it was mine to ask," he said. "Figured you'd tell me when telling was easier than not telling." She was quiet a moment, needle moving steady through the fabric. "That might be a long wait," she said. "I've got time," he said, and that was all. But something passed between them in the lamplight that neither one tried to put a name to, and the wind outside picked up and rattled the shutters, and inside the kitchen was warm, and for a moment it felt like enough. The two of them and the lamp and the unfinished mending. Though both of them understood, in the quiet way people understand things they are not ready to speak aloud, that whatever she was not telling him was going to come due eventually, the way all unpaid debts come due, in their own time and usually at the worst possible moment. The first real crack in the quiet came on a Tuesday in late November, when a man rode up the long dirt road on a horse lathered from hard travel, and Hollis, out at the barn, saw him coming the same way he'd seen Delia coming 2 months before, small against the wide brown land, and something in the set of the rider's shoulders told him this was not a friendly visit. Delia was inside at the time, and Hollis watched her come to the kitchen window when she heard the horse, watched her go very still, the way an animal goes still when it catches a scent it recognizes and does not like, and that stillness told him more than any words could have, because a woman does not go that quiet, that pale over a stranger. The man dismounted at the gate and did not come further, which Hollis noted with the same careful attention he gave everything, because a man who respects a boundary that has not been drawn is either well-mannered or calculating, and this one did not look well-mannered. He was perhaps 40, dressed better than the road warranted, with the soft-handed look of a man who worked with numbers rather than tools, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, before any greeting had passed between them. "Name of Delia. Might be going by something else now. I've reason to believe she came through this way." Hollis did not answer right away. He set down the tool he was carrying and walked to the gate at his own pace, unhurried, the same pace he'd walked toward nothing that first evening, and when he reached it, he looked the man over the way he'd looked over Delia on the road, weighing him, and did not like what the weighing told him. "Don't recall the name," Hollis said. "Lot of folks pass through on that road. Can't account for all of them." The man's jaw tightened, the particular tightness of a man unused to being denied. "This is a matter of some importance," he said. "A family matter. There's an obligation to be settled, and it's not the kind of thing that goes away because a woman runs from it." Hollis said nothing to that, only looked at him until the man mounted his horse again, promising he'd be back through the country before long, and rode off the way he'd come, and Hollis stood at the gate a long while after the dust had settled, turning the man's words over the way he turned over a stone to see what lived beneath it. He did not go straight to Delia. He finished the work he'd been doing because that was his way, letting a thing settle in him before he spoke of it. And it was near dusk before he came into the kitchen and found her standing at the window, not cooking, not mending, just standing, watching the empty road as though the man might still be visible on it. "He's gone," Hollis said. "For now," she said, and her voice had none of its usual steadiness. Hollis did not ask the question outright, because he had learned by then that pressing her only closed doors, that patience might eventually open. But he stood near her, close enough that she would know he was there, and said only, "Whatever it is, it doesn't have to be tonight." She turned to look at him then, and there was something in her face he had not seen before, a kind of exhausted gratitude, as though she had been braced for a demand and received a mercy instead. And she said, so quietly he almost missed it, "You keep doing that." "Doing what?" he said. "Not asking," she said. "Everyone always asks. You're the first person who's let me decide when." Hollis considered that a moment, and then he said, the kind of plain thing that in his mouth carried more weight than any speech could have. "Figured a person's got a right to their own timing on their own troubles. Same as I'd want if the trouble was mine." That night she did not go straight up to her room. She sat with him at the table a long while after supper, the lamp between them, and though she still did not tell him the full shape of what had come to the gate that afternoon, she told him a piece of it, the way a person tests water before deciding to wade in. She told him there had been a marriage arranged for her, back where she came from, to a man she did not choose and did not want, tied up in a debt her father had owed and could not pay, and that the man at the gate worked for the family that held that debt, and that she had left rather than be delivered into it like a settlement of accounts. She told him this much and no more, and Hollis listened without interrupting, and when she finished he did not offer comfort in words, because words felt thin against a story like that. Instead he said, "Then you're not going back to it." And it was not a question, and it was not quite a promise either, not yet, but it was close enough to one that she looked at him a long moment in the lamplight, and something in her shoulders eased for the first time since the rider had appeared on the road. Winter came down hard after that, the kind of winter that country was known for, weeks of gray sky and hard frost and snow that had to be shoveled from the barn door twice a day, and the outside world seemed to recede behind it, the man from the gate and whatever he represented growing distant the way things grow distant under enough snow. But Hollis did not mistake distance for absence. He knew, the way a man who has lived through hard winters knows, that the cold does not erase a threat, only holds it in place until the thaw, and he began, without speaking of it directly, taking certain precautions that Delia noticed but did not question. He kept a rifle nearer the door than he had before. He asked Amos to ride the far boundary more often than the work strictly required. He made a point of being in the yard, or the barn, or somewhere within easy sight of the house, whenever the sound of a wagon or a rider carried up from the road, and Delia watched him do these things and understood them for what they were, not suspicion of her, but a kind of quiet vigilance mounted on her behalf. And it was this, more than anything he might have said, that began to close the last distance between them. They spent that winter in the close proximity that hard weather forces on a household. Snowed in some days entirely, the cattle huddled in the barn's lee side, the wood stove working overtime, and in that closeness the last of the formal distance between them wore away, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of small ones, the way river stone is worn smooth not by one flood, but by 1,000 ordinary days of water passing over it. She taught him a few things he hadn't known about doctoring a sick calf, learned in some earlier life she still had not fully explained. He taught her the particular quiet trick of calming a spooked horse, a low, steady voice and a slow hand. And there was an evening in January, deep snow outside and the fire burned down to coals, when she fell asleep at the table over her mending, exhausted from a day spent hauling water when the pump froze, and Hollis, rather than wake her, took the shirt gently from her hands and set it aside, and got a blanket from the back room and laid it over her shoulders, and sat across from her a long while in the dying firelight, watching her sleep, thinking thoughts he did not yet have words for, though the shape of them was not hard to guess. It was Amos who said the thing neither of them had said aloud, riding the fence line together on a cold, clear day in February. The sky, that particular hard blue that only comes after a long freeze. "You aim to keep her on past the thaw," Amos said, not quite a question. "Or is this a winter arrangement only?" Hollis did not answer right away, watching the horizon the way he always did, before answering anything that mattered. "Don't rightly know what to call it," he said finally. "Well," said Amos, with the dry patience of a man who had watched a great many things come to pass on that land, "you'd best figure out what to call it before that fellow comes back through on his horse, because a woman standing alone against a claim like that is a different thing than a woman standing next to a man who's decided what she is to him." Hollis said nothing to that for a long while, but the words settled in him the way seed settles in turned ground, waiting for the season that would make them grow. And he understood, riding home that evening with the sky going that deep winter violet behind the ridge, that Amos was right, and that the choice in front of him was not really a choice at all, not anymore. Not once he was honest with himself about the shape his days had taken since a woman walked up his road and asked to sleep in the barn. The thaw came late that year, the way it sometimes does in that country, snow lingering in the shadowed draws well into what should have been spring, and it was in that uncertain season, mud and old snow and the first green pushing up stubborn through the wet ground, that the man from the gate returned, this time with 2 others behind him and a folded document in his coat, the kind of paper that men who work with numbers carry when they mean to make a claim official. He did not stay at the gate this time. He rode straight up to the house, and Hollis, seeing him coming from the barn, walked out to meet him with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything, though there was something different in his stride now, a settled certainty that had not been there the first time this rider crossed his land. "I've come to collect what's owed," the man said, dismounting, holding the folded paper like a weapon. "There's a contract signed by her father binding her to a marriage that settles a debt of some consequence. She's evaded it long enough. The law's on my side in this, whatever comforts you've offered her here." He said comforts with a particular curl to the word, meant to shame, and Hollis felt something go hard and quiet in his chest, the way it had gone hard and quiet only a few times in his life, at his father's grave, at his mother's, and he did not raise his voice, because raising his voice was not his way. But his words came out with an edge that made even the 2 men behind the rider shift uneasily in their saddles. "A contract signed by a father don't bind the daughter. Not out here, not under any law worth calling law," Hollis said. "And she's not evading anything. She's living. There's a difference, and any man who can't tell one from the others got no business collecting on either." The man's face colored, and he unfolded the paper, as though the document itself might argue his case better than he could, listing figures, listing terms, the cold arithmetic of a debt that treated a person as a line in a ledger, and Hollis let him finish, patient the way he was patient with a stubborn calf or a hard winter, because he understood that some men needed to exhaust their own argument before they could hear anything past it. When the man finished, Hollis said only, "How much?" The man blinked, thrown by the practicality of the question. "The debt," Hollis said again. "What figure would settle it, paid plain, no woman attached to the transaction, because that's the only kind of transaction I'll be part of." There was a long silence at that, the man doing some private calculation behind his eyes, weighing the ranch before him, its cattle, its land, its evident order, against the abstract value of a marriage that had never been more to him than a way of squaring a debt his employer held, and finally He named a figure, and Hollis, without so much as a flicker of hesitation, said, "Come inside. I'll write you a note on it, and you'll have your payment in full by the week's end. And you'll ride off this land and not come back to it. And you'll tell whoever holds that paper that the debt is closed. Closed proper, closed in dollars and not in a person. Because a person isn't collateral, not on this ranch. Not while I'm standing on it." It was, by any measure, most of what Hollis had, the savings his father had left him, and the better part of a year's expected profit from the herd, and he handed it over without a speech about sacrifice, because to him it was not a sacrifice so much as an obvious accounting, the plainest kind of arithmetic there was, a debt on one side and a woman's whole life on the other, and no honest scale could weigh those two things as equal, let alone find the debt heavier. The man took the note, folded the paper back into his coat, and rode off the way he'd come. And this time he did not say he'd be back, because there was nothing left to come back for. Delia had come to the doorway partway through this exchange, and she stood there now, one hand on the frame, watching the riders shrink into the distance the way she had watched them arrive months before. Only now there was no fear in her stillness, only a kind of stunned quiet. The quiet of a person watching a weight lift that she had carried so long she'd forgotten what her shoulders felt like without it. Hollis walked back toward the house, and when he reached her, he did not offer a speech either, though she seemed to be waiting for one, some explanation of why a man would hand over the better part of his savings for a woman he had known less than a year. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, and her voice was not quite steady. "Didn't have to," Hollis agreed. "Wanted to. There's a difference, same as I told him." She looked at him a long moment, the spring light behind her, mud on the yard, the last of the old snow melting off the roof in a slow, steady drip. And she said, "Why?" Just that one word, and it carried in it every question she had not asked in all the months since she'd walked up that road, and Hollis, who was not a man given to speeches, gave her the plainest answer he had, the kind of answer that in his mouth was closer to a vow than any ornate declaration could have been. "Because you're not a debt to be settled," he said. "You're the reason this house stopped being empty. Man doesn't put a price on that. He just pays whatever's asked to keep it." She did not answer that in words. She stepped forward instead and pressed her forehead against his chest, the way a person leans against something they have finally trusted enough to hold their weight, and Hollis put his arms around her, careful, the way he was careful with everything, and they stood like that a long while in the mud and the melting snow, saying nothing further because nothing further needed saying. The spring that followed was the kind of spring that seemed determined to make up for the long, hard winter, warm, early, and generous with rain, and the ranch woke around them the way it always woke that time of year, calves dropping in the near pasture, the cottonwoods budding green, the creek running full and loud with snowmelt. Amos came by more often than the work strictly required, and if anyone noticed that he'd started bringing an extra loaf of his wife's bread on those visits, as though the household had grown and needed feeding, no one remarked on it directly because that was not the way of that country, but the gesture was its own kind of announcement, quiet and understood by everyone who saw it. The town, when word finally reached it, took the story and turned it over, the way small towns do, some saying Hollis Cade was a fool to hand over his savings for a stranger, others saying he was the shrewdest man in the county, having traded money that comes and goes for a life that, once built right, does not. And Delia heard both versions eventually, standing at the mercantile counter, and found she did not mind either one, because both versions, however differently intended, arrived at the same plain fact, which was that a man had looked at a debt meant to claim a person and decided instead to erase it, and had never once, in doing so, made her feel like the thing being purchased. They were married that June, a small gathering, Amos and his wife, a scattering of neighbors from the surrounding ranches. the kind of ceremony that did not need more than it had, held in the yard beneath the cottonwoods his mother had planted, and Delia wore a dress she had sewn herself over the preceding weeks. Evenings by lamplight, the same steady hands that had once mended his shirts, now turning thread into something meant only for that one day. Hollis stood beside her in the shade of those trees and said his vows plainly, without ornament, the same way he said everything that mattered. And when it came his turn to speak beyond the required words, he added only one line that those who were there remembered long after, a line that folded the whole shape of their story into a single sentence. "I told her once the barn was no place for a person to sleep," he said. "I aim to spend the rest of my life proving that this house is." They filled the empty rooms slowly, the way a house is meant to be filled, not all at once, but season by season, a chair added here, a shelf of books there, and within 2 years a child's cradle stood in the room that had sat empty since Hollis's own childhood, and the table that had once seated 6 for a lone man eating at its corner now filled most evenings with the ordinary noise of a family, Amos and his wife often among them, the old silence of the house replaced by something warmer and far more crowded, though never crowded in a way that felt like too much. The barn stood exactly where it had always stood, silver gray with age, sound through every winter that followed, and the small room off the side, once meant for tack, became in time a place where Delia kept the seeds she saved each fall for the next year's planting, jars of them lined along a shelf built by Hollis's own hands, a small, quiet symbol neither of them ever spoke of directly, but which both understood. The room that had once been offered as a stranger's shelter now holding, instead, the promise of everything still to grow. Years later, when their own children were old enough to ask about how their parents had met, Delia would tell them, in her own plain way, that she had come up the road one evening with nothing but a bag and a question, and that she had asked to sleep in the barn, and that their father had answered her in a way that changed the whole shape of her life, though she never repeated his exact words, letting the children imagine them however they liked, because some answers, she had come to believe, were not meant to be handed down whole, only felt in the warmth of the house that still stood behind the cottonwoods, in the steady presence of the man who had built it, stone by stone and season by season, into something that no longer had any empty rooms left in it at all, and who still, on quiet evenings, walked out to check the barn before turning in, not because anyone slept there anymore, but because some habits, once they have meant enough, a person keeps simply out of love for what they once represented, and stands there a moment in the dark, looking at the old timber gone silver with age, remembering the woman who once stood at his gate asking for so little, and the answer he had given her without knowing yet how completely that answer would come to define the rest of his life.